if you want to make yourself articulate, which is a very good idea, then not only should you read, but you should write down what you think. And if you can do that a little bit every day, 15 minutes, maybe you could steal 15 minutes and do it every day. But if you do that for 10 years, you really straighten out your thinking. If you're going to speak effectively, you have to know way more than you're talking about, you know. So this is often difficult for beginning lecturers at university, because they'll do a lecture on a topic, but they only know as much as they're saying in the lecture. And they get kind of stuck to their notes because of it. But you want to know 10 times as much as you are saying in the lecture, and then you can specify a stepping path through it and elaborate with the other things that you know. But to do that, you have to do a lot of reading. But you also have to do a lot of reading, because that's where the synthesizing comes. So that's on the input side. And then on the output side, well, there's some techniques, let's say, is like if you're speaking in front of a group, you are not delivering a talk to a group. That's not what you're doing. The talk isn't a packaged thing that you present to a group. There isn't a group. There's a bunch of individuals, and you talk to them. So when I talk to a group, I always talk to people one at a time. And that makes it easier too, because you know how to talk to a person. It's like, can you talk to 1,000 people? Well, probably not, because it's too intimidating. But there isn't 1,000 people there. There's 1,000 individuals. And so you just look at an individual and you say something, and you can tell if they're engaged. They look confused, or they look interested, or they look angry, or they look bored, or maybe they're asleep, in which case you look at someone else. And they give you feedback about how you're doing. And so one thing is to have something to say, yeah, but the next thing is pay attention to who you're talking to. Because unless you're very badly socialized, and that seems unlikely in your case, because you present yourself at least moderately well, and well, I mean, I don't know you very well, but on first sight, you're doing fine. So the probability that if you pay attention to the individuals that you're talking to, that your natural wealth of social skill will manifest itself is extremely high. And so you don't deliver a talk to an audience. That's a really bad way of thinking about it. You're actually engaged in a conversation with an audience. Even if they're not talking, they're nodding and shifting position and looking like this, and you can pull all that in and use it to govern the level at which you're addressing the entire audience. So the last thing I would say is, well, having the aim to be a good communicator is a good start. And you think, well, I could buttress that to some degree. Well, there isn't anything that you can possibly, this is the whole point of a liberal education, there isn't anything that you can possibly do that makes you more competent in everything you do than to learn how to communicate. I don't care if you're going to be a carpenter. I mean, being a carpenter, by the way, is very difficult, especially if you're a good carpenter. But if you're good at communicating as a carpenter, you're like 10 times better as a carpenter. So, and this is something that the liberal arts colleges, I think, I don't know if they've forgotten it, but they don't do a very good job of marketing. It's like, well, what's the use of a bachelor's degree, a Bachelor of Arts? It's like, well, you can think, you can write, you can speak, you've read something. It's like, the economic value of that is incalculable. The people that I've watched in my life who've been spectacularly successful they have skills. Clearly, that's a minimum precondition. But they're also very, very good at articulating themselves. And so whenever they negotiate, they're successful. Well, that's kind of like the definition of success in life, right? You negotiate and it doesn't mean you win. Because if you're a good negotiator, if you're a really good negotiator, everybody walks away from the negotiation thrilled. And so then people line up to do things with you. So, and that's all dependent on your ability to communicate. So. Okay, we're having a conversation. I'm deciding I'm going to listen to you, right? That's different than how people generally communicate, because usually when they communicate, they're doing something like, okay, we're going to have a conversation and I'm going to tell you why I'm right and I'll win if you agree. Or maybe you're having a conversation where, I don't know what you're trying to do. Maybe you're trying to impress the person you're talking to. So you're not listening to them at all. You're just thinking about what you're going to say next. Okay, so that's not this. This is, you might have something to tell me. And so I'm going to listen on the off chance that you'll tell me something that would really be useful for me to know. And so if you agree with me and I find that out, I know nothing more than I knew before. I just know what I knew before. And maybe I'm happy about that because, you know, it didn't get challenged. But I'm no smarter than I was before. But maybe you're different than me, and so while I'm listening to you, you'll tell me something I don't like. Maybe it's something I find contemptible or difficult, whatever. Maybe you'll tell me something I don't know, and then I won't be quite as stupid. And then maybe I won't run painfully into quite as many things. And that's a really useful thing to know, especially if you live with someone and you're trying to make long-term peace with them, is they're not the same as you. And their way they look at the world and the facts that they pull out of the world aren't the same as your facts. And even though you're going to be overwhelmed with the proclivity to demonstrate that you're right, it is the case that two brains are better than one. And so maybe 9 of the 10 things they tell you are dispensable, or maybe even 49 out of 50, but one thing, all you need to get out of the damn conversation is one thing you don't know. And one of the things that's very cool about a good psychotherapeutic session is that the whole conversation is like that. All you're doing is trying to express the truth of the situation as clearly as possible. That's it. And so now Roger's proposition, and I'll tell you why he derived it, was that if you have a conversation like that with someone, it will make both of you better. It'll make both of you psychologically healthier. So there's an implicit presupposition that the exchange of truth is curative. Well, that's a very cool idea. I mean, it's a very deep idea. It's the idea upon which Western civilization, although not only Western civilization, is actually predicated. The idea that truth produces health. But for Rogers, that was the entire purpose of the Psychotherapeutic Alliance. You come to see me because you want to be better. You don't even know what that means necessarily, neither do I. We're going to figure that out together. But you come and you say, look, things are not acceptable to me, and maybe there's something I could do about that. So that's the minimal precondition to engage in therapy. Something's wrong, you're willing to talk about it truthfully, and you want it to be better. Without that, the therapeutic relationship does not get off the ground. And so then you might ask, well, what relationships are therapeutic? And the answer to that would be, if you have a real relationship, it's therapeutic. If it isn't, what you have is not a relationship. God only knows what you have. You're a slave, they're a tyrant, you know, you're both butting heads with one another. It's a primate dominance hierarchy dispute. Oh, I don't know, you're like two cats in a barrel, or two people with their hands around each other's throats. But what you have is not a relationship. One of the things I try to do in my therapeutic sessions is, first of all, to listen, to really listen. And then while I listen, I watch, and while I'm listening, things will happen in my head. You know, maybe I'll get a little image of something, or I'll get a thought or a question will emerge, and then I'll just tell the person what that is. But it's sort of directionless, you know, it's not like I have a goal, except that we're trying to make things better. I'm on the side of the part of the person that wants things to be better, not worse. And so those parts of us have a dialogue, and the consequence of that dialogue is that certain things take place, and then I'll just tell the person what happened. And it isn't that I'm right. That's not the point. The point is that they get to have an hour where someone actually tells them what they think. Here's the impact you're having on me. This is making me angry. This is making me happy. This is really interesting. This reminds me of something that you said an hour ago that I don't quite understand. And the whole point is not for either person to make the proposition or convince the other that their position is correct, but merely to have an exchange of experience about how things are set up. And it's extraordinarily useful for people, because it's often difficult for anyone to find anyone to talk to that will actually listen. And so another thing that's really strange about this listening is that if you listen to people, they will tell you the weirdest bloody things so fast you just cannot believe it. So if you're having a conversation with someone and it's dull, it's because you're not listening to them properly, because they're weird. They're like
wombats or albatrosses or rhinoceroses or something. Like, they're strange creatures. And so if you were actually communicating with them and they were telling you how weird they really are, it would be anything but boring. And you can ask questions. That's a really good way of listening. But one of Roger's points is, well, you have to be oriented properly in order to listen. And the orientation has to be, look, what I want out of this conversation is that the place we both end up is better than the place we left. That's it. That's what I'm after. And if you're not after that, you got to think, why the hell wouldn't you be after that? What could you possibly be after that would be better than that? You walk away smarter and more well-equipped for the world than you were before you had the conversation, and so does the other person. Well, maybe if you're bitter and resentful and angry and anxious and, you know, generally annoyed at the world, then that isn't what you want. You want the other person to walk away worse, and you too, because you're full of revenge. But, you know, you'll get what you want if you do that. So we know from our research that such empathic understanding with a person, not about him, is such an effective approach that it can bring about major changes in personality. Some of you may be feeling that you listen well to people and that you have never seen such results. The chances are very great that you have not been listening in the manner that I've described. Fortunately, I can suggest a little experiment that you can do to test the quality of your understanding. The next time you get into an argument with your wife or your friend or a small group of friends, stop the discussion for a moment and, for an experiment, institute this rule. Each person can speak up for himself only after he has first restated the ideas and feelings of the previous speaker accurately. What accurately means is they have to agree with your restatement. Now, that's an annoying thing to do, because if someone is talking to you and you disagree with them, the first thing you want to do is take their argument, make the stupidest possible thing out of it that you can. That's the straw man, and then demolish it. It's like, so then you can walk away feeling good about it, and, you know, you dominated them really nicely. But that isn't what you do. You say, okay, well, I'm going to take what you told me, and maybe I'm even going to make your argument stronger than the one you made. That's useful if you're dealing with someone that you have to live with, because maybe they can't bloody well express themselves very well, but they have something to say. So you make their argument strong. All right, then you see what this would mean. It would mean that before presenting your own point of view, it would be necessary for you to really achieve the other speaker's frame of reference, to understand his thoughts and feelings so well that you could summarize them for him. Sounds simple, doesn't it? But if you will try it, you'll find that it's the most difficult thing that you've ever done.
There's a book. There's a book called About Face. It's about a guy that was in the Korean War and then he was in the Vietnam War, and his name is Colonel David Hackworth. When I was on deployment, I would open up that book anywhere, and I would read 2 pages or 3 pages before I'd go to bed if I was in my bed that night. And there were so many lessons that correlated to what I was actually going through. And a real obvious example was, when you read, you can learn, and you don't have to go through the school of hard knocks. You don't have to get punched in the face repeatedly with things that turn out to be situations that other people have absolutely gone through. The level of capability increases so much by seeing something one single time. Well, if I see something one time, I'm infinitely better than if I'd never seen it before. It's like those little puzzles. They give you a little puzzle, some kind of a mind bender, right? The mind benders only work on you one time. The riddle only works on you one time. Then you go, I know the answer to that. That's the answer. You never get fooled by that again. So just seeing it one time, you're infinitely better. So when you read enough, you're capturing all these lessons.
Of course, you want to put the book on. You want to become that person. That can rattle you up, man. Especially if the person is thinking all sorts of things that you've never thought. I mean, I love reading for that reason. I could pick my peers too, which I really loved. It's like, well, I have these people around me, but then there's these people who've lived before me and in different places, and I can set them up on my shelf. I can enter into their world, and I can benefit from everything they've thought and saturate myself with that person. It's very disruptive, especially if the person that you're reading has a mind that's more powerful and more well-developed than your own. It was very disruptive, but unbelievably useful to try on other people like that. And you get the benefit of their entire life distilled into their book. It's 30 years of work. I read this one book called The Neuropsychology of Anxiety, which is it's a great scientific work. It's a very hard book. I think it has 1,800 references, something like that. And this guy, Jeffrey Gray, he actually read all those references and he understood them. And so it took me 6 months to read the book, but I got an entire education out of it. I got to experience in 6 months what it took him 30 years to learn. Like, what a gift that is. It's unbelievable. What were you reading when you were in university? Was it fiction, novels? Was it nonfiction? What were you focusing on?
As trite as this may sound, it was actually the most impact was from Shakespeare. It was the most impact on multiple levels. And I'll tell you the primary level. And when I've covered Shakespeare on my podcast, I explain this to people. People think, well, you know, I didn't really understand. I read it, I didn't understand it. If you think you're going to just pick up Shakespeare, open it up and read it and understand it, you're not going to, because it's barely written in English. It's barely written in English. It's almost another language. So what you have to do is you have to start to interpret it. And so what I realized with Shakespeare is, number one, the weight of the words, that these words were so pregnant with meaning that you had to pull those words and parse those words and pull those words apart to see all the depth that each individual word had, and then the way that they're put together. And what was great about this was, by the time I was back, because then I went right back into the SEAL teams, and somebody would hand me a rules of engagement document that was written by some lawyer in Washington, D.C., and I'd pull it out and say, wait a second, this word, I don't know what this word means. So let's pull this word out. Let's see what this actual definition of this particular word is, and how that changes my viewpoint of these rules of engagement, and how can I translate that for my troops so that they actually know what to do. So that part for me was, from a reading perspective, starting to read Shakespeare and saying, oh, okay, you're not going to understand this. And if you don't understand something, that's okay. You pull out the Oxford English Dictionary and you look it up. And then you not just find out what the meaning of the word is, but what's the root word and where does it come from and what kind of depth and what kind of...
Yeah, and that's really, that's unbelievably useful too. Virtually every word is like that, because a word is an ancient artifact. It's like an animal in some sense. It has an evolutionary history and it transforms across time. And each word it carries the echoes of its past with it too, because each word attracts other words in a particular unique way. So it kind of lives in a word ecosystem as well. And the ecosystem contains information about the history of that word. And you think, well, why is that important? It's like, well, hey, guess what? You think in words, you talk in words, you have all these archaic entities, these words, these living entities that you use. It's like the more you know about them, the more you know about you, the more you know about other people, and the better you are at formulating and communicating your ideas. There's nothing lost in that kind of investigation. There's nothing but gain there.
If you can communicate in those means, speaking, writing, and if you can think, you are so powerful that nothing can stop you. You think about it, well, what do you mean? Well, I don't care who you are. I don't care if you're a plumber or a waitress. Not that there's anything wrong with being a plumber or a waitress, because there isn't. It's like, you're going to negotiate for a raise, you're going to negotiate for a promotion, you're going to negotiate how your customers treat you, you're going to negotiate how you advertise yourself, for example, with regards to picking up customers. That's all articulated linguistic ability, the ability to express yourself. If you're good at that, you win, period. And so, right, look, there's a reason, like the children of rich people took liberal arts degrees. Why? Because the rich knew that that was the best possible training for leadership positions. And it wasn't because it was a romp through the park for 4 years and then daddy's inheritance. It was because if you learned how to communicate, you were unstoppable. You can accomplish what you want to accomplish if you're being wise about it, by being eminently reasonable. That's the thing, is you can have reason on your side, and I mean reason in the best possible sense. It's like, you don't have to be temperamental and impulsive in this sort of situation. You can try to put yourself together, which I would highly recommend, and then you can lay yourself open to the attacks. Now that means you should be able to defend yourself. You should have the articulated structures at hand. You should orient yourself properly, politically and philosophically, and even physically for that matter, so that you're a force to contend with. But once you have that down, then you play it with the lightest possible hand. And that way also you have the highest probability of let's say, of changing the minds of people who are possessed by an ideology so that they can rejoin the productive political dialogue. And that's what you want. You don't want to defeat them. First of all, good luck with that. It's like, well, you've got to live with them. You can't defeat people that you live with, because there they are the next day. And if you defeat them, well, then they're defeated. Maybe that's not for the best. And second, it's not like they're happy about the fact that they're defeated. It's not like they're not going to be waiting around to find out when they can defeat you next. It's like if you're married to someone, think, well, I won that argument. It's like, no, you didn't. No, you didn't, because there that person is, waking up next to you the next day. And so if you won, you know, and they're defeated and humiliated because of it, then the probability that they're going to react properly to you, if they have any sense at all, is very low. And so what you want is you want to negotiate your way to a sustainable peace. And that's what you want to do in the political realm too, because, well, in this country, you know, there's a certain amount of polarization. I don't think it's anywhere near as bad as the media is making it out to be, as they go through their death spirals and generate clickbait like mad. Because, you know, in the US, you guys have been voting 50% Republican and 50% Democrat for what, about 20 years, right down the middle. It hasn't changed that much. But these people who are on the opposite side of the political spectrum from you, they're the people who live across the street. They're the people who live down the street. They're family members, for that matter. And you're going to have to live with them. It's like you don't want to defeat them. You want to bring them back into the reasonable political dialogue. And you do that by having a certain amount, first of all, by getting your act together so that you're a credible and admirable person, but then by having some forbearance and negotiating towards peace. If you concentrate solely on your career, you can get a long way in your career. And I would say that that's a strategy that a minority of men preferentially do. That's all they do. They work like 70, 80 hours a week. They go flat out on their career. They're staking everything on the small probability of exceptional status in a narrow domain. But it's hard on them. They don't have a life. It's very difficult for them to have a family. They don't know how to take any leisure activity. Like, they get very one-dimensional. Now, it may be that unidimensionality is the price you have to pay to be exceptional at one thing, right? Because if you're going to be something like a genius-level mathematician, and you want to do that or a scientist, say, it's like you're in your lab all the time, you're working 70 hours a week or 80 hours a week, you're smart, you're dedicated, you're unidimensional, and that's how you get to beat all the other people who are doing that. It's the only way. But the problem is you don't get a life. Now, if you love being a scientist and you have that kind of focus of mind, well, first of all, you're a rare person, and second, you're going to pay for it. But fine, more power to you. But it's a risky business to do that. You sacrifice a lot for it, you know. And I would say most often, if you're speaking about having a healthy life, that isn't what you do. You spread yourself out more. So, you know, you have a family, you have some things that you do outside of work that are meaningful to you and useful. You have a network of friends. Well, those 3 things alone, or 4 things alone, are plenty to keep you well oriented. And then if one of those things collapses, you know, everything doesn't go. Now, the price you pay for that is the more you strive to optimize that balance, the less likely you are to be fantastically successful at any single one of them. But you might have a very, you know, if you consider your life as a whole, that might be a winning strategy. One of the things Carl Jung said, I really liked this. He thought that men went after perfection and women went after wholeness. There's something different at the top of the value hierarchy. So perfection would be stake it all on one thing and look for radical success. Not that all men do that, because they don't, but we're talking about extremes, at least with regards to the men that do that. The wholeness idea is more like, well, it's like I want one thing in my life to be 150%, or I want 5 things in my life to be 80%. Well,
there's a lot more richness in a life where you have 5 things operating at 80%, but you're not operating at any of them at 150%. So, and I really believe this because I've watched men and women go through their careers now for a long period of time, and one of the things that, there's lots of things that produce this, but one of the things that I've noticed is that mostly women in their 30s bail out of unidimensional careers. They won't do them. They won't put in the 80 hours a week that they would have to put in order to dominate that particular area. And it isn't, the reason that they won't do it is because they decide it's not worth it. And no wonder, because why would that be worth it? You have to ask yourself that. It's like, well, you want to be an outstanding scientist. It's like, okay, really, that's what you want, because that means that's what you do. Because you're competing with other people, you know, they're smart, they're hardworking, and if you want to be at the top, you have to be smarter and work harder than any of them. And working hard means working long hours. I mean, it also means working diligently, but in the final analysis, it's also an additive issue. If I'm smart and hardworking and I can crank out for 70 hours a week, and you do it for 30, it's like, in 2 years, I'm so far ahead of you, you will never, ever catch up. So, anyways. And I think partly, maybe part of the reason too that women are oriented that way more than men, I think there's 2 reasons. One is socioeconomic status does not make women more attractive on the mating market, but it does make men more attractive. And the second is women's time frame is compressed, right? Because guys can always say, well, I'll have kids later. And they can say that till they're like 80. Whereas women, it's like, no way, man, you got to get it together by the time you're, let's say 40, but really probably by 35, but definitely by 40, because otherwise it ain't happening. And that's bloody dreadful. One of the common routes to extreme unhappiness is to want children and not have them. I wouldn't recommend that. You know, you see couples who are in their 30s. 1 couple in 3 over the age of 30 has fertility problems. That's defined as inability to conceive after 1 year of trying. 1 in 3. So it's worth thinking about, because people are very, very unhappy if they want to have kids and then they can't. Man, you're in the medical mill for 10 years if that's what happens to you. We've got a hypothesis that we're still working out that's supported to some degree by the relevant literature. So imagine that you're looking for a stable partner, right? So you might think, well, what do you want in a stable partner? And at least in principle, one of the things you don't want is too much mismatch between you and that person on the 5 fundamental dimensions. So for example, if you're really extroverted and you have a really introverted partner, you're going to engage in continual conflict about how much social activity the 2 of you should subject yourself to. And it's very, very difficult for people who widely differ on those dimensions to come to consensus, because it's not just a matter of opinion, right? It's really a matter of different, if you're looking at extremes, of really different types of people. And the thing about introverts is they just don't enjoy large-scale social interaction that much. One-on-one they're often fine, but in a group they don't like that, and it tires them out. Whereas a real extrovert, it's like you isolate them and they just wither on the vine, because a huge part of what actually motivates them in a positive way is tangled up with social interaction. And so if you're an agreeable person and you have a particularly disagreeable partner, you're also going to run into problems, because the agreeable person will say whatever you want whenever, and the disagreeable person will say, well, I'd like to know what the hell you want for a change, and be much more harsh and much more demanding in the situation. And the agreeable person is going to find the disagreeable person harsh and unpleasant, and the disagreeable person is going to find the agreeable person wishy-washy and unable to stand up for themselves. And again, that's actually one of the primary sources of tension between men and women, because women tend to be higher in agreeableness than men. It's about half a standard deviation, which is quite a large difference by psychological standards. And so what that means, I probably haven't got the statistic quite right. If you have a group of men and women and you pick out random pairs, the woman is going to be more agreeable than the man 60% of the time. So that's not an overwhelming proportion, but it's reliable, and it's quite large by psychological standards. So there's the problem with agreeableness. With conscientiousness, well, if you're conscientious, you're industrious and orderly. And orderly people seem to be sensitive to disgust, which is something we'll talk about in detail later. We've had a hard time specifying exactly what makes industrious people industrious, because it's hard to come up with an animal model for that sort of thing, and there's no theoretical model. But our latest idea is that, it's not my idea, it's actually the idea of my graduate student, Christine Brophy, is that industrious people find it unpleasant and unsettling to not be doing something. And you can write about what you think about the problems that obsess you, and you can become articulate as a consequence. And there'll be nothing about that that isn't the adventure of your life. Right? To become articulate is to become the master of your own tongue. To become properly articulate is to make the word divine and to treat it in that manner. The divine word creates the order that's habitable and good. And if you do believe that, go all in. See what happens if you become articulate.
The most dangerous person is one who is articulate. What would you recommend to a one who wants to learn to speak in a more articulate manner?
Well, articulate is an interesting word, because if your joints are articulated, and that means you can do things with them because they're articulated, right? They're not one solid, vague mass. They're differentiated. And someone who's graceful is articulated and compelling because they're articulated. And speech is a form of articulation in that manner because the act of speech itself is extremely complicated. It's a very complicated motor activity, right? It's a very complicated action to dance with your tongue, let's say. It is definitely the case that there is no more exceptional form of the capacity to be dangerous than to be articulate. And one of the things that really shocks me, and part of the reason that my son and I and our co-workers developed this essay app, is that young men in particular are never taught this. Why be literate? Do you want to be competent and dangerous, or do you want to be vague and useless? Because those are your options. And I don't care what your job is. If you're a plumber, I have great respect for plumbers, by the way, and you're articulate, you can negotiate with your clients, you can introduce your coworkers, you can make a case for your employees, you can advertise your services, you can think through your problems. You're firing on all cylinders. Our whole culture is based on the idea of the supremacy of the word. Our whole culture is based on the idea that it is the word itself that extracts habitable order from chaos and possibility. And the reason our culture is predicated on that is because it's a deep truth. And to the degree that our culture actually embodies that, it works. It's a great thing to be articulate. It would be so lovely if our educators were wise enough to communicate this appropriately to young men who are striving forward, and to let them know in no uncertain terms that if they want to make themselves into forces to be contended with, that there's no surer route to that than an exceptional poetic literacy. Now, it's not like young people don't have an intuition of this. There are reasons they admire rap musicians, for example, who are often extraordinarily articulate in their performance and their capacity for spontaneous poetic utterance. And certainly the greatest people I've met, including great warriors, you might say, are great in no small part because they're articulate. I know a former special services, special operations soldier, Jocko Willink. Some of you might know about Jocko. He's about 4 feet wide and about 3 feet thick, and he's one tough son of a bitch. I'll tell you, you don't want to mess with him, and he knows perfectly well and is very capable of articulating the fact that his success as a eminent warrior is in no small part dependent on his ability to communicate. Because he could communicate well, he could listen to the men who were under his command. Because he was articulate, he could explain to his superiors the situation on the ground. Because he was articulate, he could make a case that the men under his command who were deserving would be promoted. Because he could think in an articulate manner, he could plan strategically and not lose battles. And what's the alternative? You want to be inarticulate? You want to say and like and and pause and stumble and be unable to formulate a strategy, be unable to elucidate a vision, be unable to compel and convince other people, to entice them with your articulated vision of what might be? You want the opposite of that? Why would you want that? You would choose awkwardness over grace? It's preposterous. It's beyond foolish. And I cannot understand for the life of me why this case isn't made in a compelling manner, particularly to young men. And I know it's not being articulated to young men because they're dropping out of the educational realm in droves. And it's unbelievably sad. So, how do you become articulate? Well, by paying attention to what you say. You can think of this as an analogy. Imagine that you're trying to walk across a swamp, and the swamp is murky. But you know there's a path under the water, but it twists and moves. And if you stay on the path, you won't drown. The crocodiles in the swamp won't devour you. And as you walk forward, you can feel with your next step where the stone might be. And then you feel it's solid, then you take that step, and then you do the same thing with your foot again. You search and you find out what's solid, and you step on it, and you move forward in that manner. That's what you do with your words. It's the same thing. You feel, and you feel, is this the right word? Is the fact that I'm uttering it putting me together and making me intact and stronger, or is it tearing me apart and making me dissolute and weak? And you can learn to do that. I learned this in part from reading Carl Rogers, who's a great clinician, and Rogers believed that the integration of language and action was a necessary precondition for operation as an effective clinician, that you had to align what you said with who you were, and that one of the things that your clients would be evaluating you for was that capability. And you might say that someone with that capability manifests themselves as genuine and trustworthy. And more than that, I would say also as compelling and interesting, although that can be gamed. You feel your way. I noticed 40 years ago when I started thinking these things through that much of what I said actually made me feel weak. I didn't know why exactly, but sometimes some of the things I said didn't have that effect. They weren't accompanied by a sense of shame, let's say. They weren't accompanied with a sense of vulnerability. They were solid. And at the beginning, that was probably only about 5% of what I said. The rest of it was instrumental. You know, it was language I was using to get my way in the manner that Tammy described when she introduced me tonight. There was an arrogance in my use of language that had to do with the desire to attain proximal victories, right? To appear smart, let's say, to win an argument, something like that. A very different idea than merely feeling my way along to see what word was appropriate for what moment. But you can learn to do that. And you can listen to yourself, and you can stop humming and hawing and using like and you know and fillers. And you can take the time necessary to craft your words carefully. And you can practice merely saying what you believe to be true. And you can read. And you can read great writers. And you can write. And you can write about what you think about the problems that obsess you. And you can become articulate as a consequence. And there'll be nothing about that that isn't the adventure of your life. And so it's a moral endeavor in some real sense. Right? To become articulate is to become the master of your own tongue. And to become properly articulate is to make the word divine. And to treat it in that manner. And to decide whether or not you believe that it is the case that the divine word creates the order that's habitable and good. And if you do believe that, well, go all in. See what happens. See what happens if you become articulate. I'll give you one more small example. Tammy touched on this in the introduction too. She said she'd learned to pause. You can pause. It's a prayerful pause in some sense. When you're in a discussion with someone, you can ask yourself, they might present you with a question or a conundrum or a proposition, And instead of responding with what you know to be right, so to speak, you could just ask yourself, what do I actually think about that? But it has to be a real question. It has to be the kind of question that you'd pose to someone you didn't know. It has to be a question predicated on the idea that you might not know who you are and that you could ask. And so someone will present you with a question, you think, okay, what do I think about that? But you have to want to know the answer, and then the answer will make itself known, because that's how thought works, and then you can just communicate that answer. And if you do that, you'll be interesting right away. You'll be interesting to the person that you're talking to. And if they do that to you, they'll be interesting too. And then if you both do that, you'll have an interesting conversation. And if you have an interesting conversation, you'll both grow as a consequence. And that's actually the pathway to growth. And you just wait. You can wait. You can open yourself up to the possibility that what needs to be said will make itself manifest, if that's what you are striving for, if that's what you're asking for. And then you can merely communicate that. You have to abandon instrumentality to do that. So one of the reasons Joe Rogan is so successful, by the way, he just asks questions. He isn't trying to get something from his guests. He's not trying to become more famous. He doesn't need any more money. There's no instrumental utilization of language in his discourse. He's just a humble lunkhead, you know, in the most profound sense, who would like to know more than he knows, and who asks all the stupid questions he can think up. And it turns out that he's actually very, very smart and very well educated now, after talking to hundreds and hundreds of people and listening. And so the stupid questions he asks aren't stupid, and they're questions that are shared by virtually everyone who's listening. And he takes his listeners along on this process of exploratory endeavor, and it's the pathway to success. And the same thing can be true of your life. The pathway to success is much, if you're guided by the spirit of honest inquiry and every word you say is reflective of what you believe to be the truth, then the pathway that you walk on is a golden pathway to success. And I know that. I know that to be true.
Look, let's say you're socially anxious. Okay, so what happens when you're socially anxious? You go to a party, your heart's beating. Why? The party is a monster. Why? Because it's judging you. And it's judging you, it's putting you low down the dominance hierarchy, because that's what a negative judgment is. And that interferes with your sexual success. And that means that you're being harshly evaluated by nature itself. Right? So you are confronting the dragon of chaos when you go into the social situation. And so what do? You're like this, right? You hunch over, and that's low dominance. I'm no threat. It's like, well, that's not going to get you very far. You know, but that's a logical thing to do in the face of a tyrant. So I'm no threat. You know, you look at the king and you're dead. I'm no threat. I'm hunched over. And then what's happening internally? What are people thinking about me? What are people thinking about me? Am I looking stupid? Am I looking foolish? Geez, I'm awkward. I hate being here. Man, I'm sweating too much. It's all internalized, right? It's all self-focused. The eye isn't working. What do you tell people? Don't stop thinking about yourself, because you can't. It's like, don't think of a white elephant. White elephant, white elephant, white elephant. You can't tell someone to stop thinking about something because they get caught in a loop. What you do with socially anxious people is you say, look at other people. Look at them, right? Why? Because if you look at them, you can tell what they're thinking. And then unless you're terribly socialized, and some people are. Some people have no social skills. And so the reason they can't go to a party is because they don't even know how to introduce themselves. Like no one ever taught them how to behave. And so they're really good candidates for behavior therapy, because you walk them through the process of how you actually manifest the procedures that are associated with social acceptability. But most people aren't like that. They have the ability.
So if they're really introverted and high in neuroticism, they can usually talk quite well to someone one-on-one. Why? Because they look at them. Well, if I look at you, it's another thing to do if you're ever speaking to a group of people. Never speak to the group of people. It doesn't exist. You talk to individuals, and then they reflect for you the entire group, because they're all entrained. So you look at one person, they broadcast to you what everyone's thinking, and you know how to talk to one person. So it's easy. So as soon as you focus on the person, not you, you push your attention outward, use your eye, you push your attention outward, and you start watching. Well, then all your automatic mechanisms kick in, and you stop being awkward. Because if we're talking, and I'm looking here, I don't know what you're going to do next, and I'm going to put disjunctions into the, they're like bad chords in the melody of our conversation. And the reason is I'm not paying attention. So that's why the eye is the thing at the top of the pyramid. It's like the thing that enables you to win the set of all possible dominance hierarchies is the eye. Pay attention. Pay attention. That's the critical issue. That's why the Egyptians worshipped Horus. That's why Horus was the thing that rescued Osiris from the depths. It's the capacity to pay attention. What do you pay attention to most? What your right hemisphere signals as anomalous. It attracts your attention. It's like, this isn't going quite right. I'm not looking at that. Wrong. That's what you look at. That's what you look at. What's not going right. Because that's the terrible monster that might eat you, but it's also the place you get all the information. So that's why it's useful to have discussions with your enemies, because they will tell you things you do not know. And that's such a great thing, because if you don't know them, well, you're not very smart, are you? You know, there may be a time when you go somewhere that's the thing you need to know. And maybe your enemy will tell you why you're such a fool, you know, and a bunch of other things that aren't true too. But even one thing that's accurate, it's like, yeah, thanks very much, man, maybe I'll do some work on that, and I won't have to carry that forward. So, and then that's part of the reason, again, why the terrible predator, it's always the terrible predator that has the gold. It's like, it's the person who delivers the message you do not want to hear. So it's rough, but it doesn't matter. Life is rough.
So I'd be interested in hearing some more impressions, if you'd be kind enough to deliver some of them. What are your favorites?
Let me conjure up the gods here.
That is what I'm trying to do, when I'm doing that. It's like, let's get those words out of the chaos.
It is helpful when I saw you looking up, because everybody has this shame when they're thinking, you know, and you look down. So that's a habit I pulled from you. You're not even in my impressions, but it just conveys confidence when you're thinking to go, you know, you're going to put your head up and make yourself vulnerable. Opposed to, well, where, you know, what did she like in bed?
I hadn't really thought about it as a more open posture, but that's right. It is a more open posture. Well, and you're also, you know, turning your eyes heavenward symbolically, and you embody your meanings. That's the deepest sense of meaning, is what's embodied, right? What you're actually acting out. And it is a form of searching for the words, to find them, not to calculate them, but to find them. That's how Moses crossed the Red Sea, you know, by looking for a firm foundation in the chaos.
We all know that.
Yeah. Well, that's a good thing to know, you know, because you'll find some chaos, and you need to know how to get through it. And you look for a firm foundation, and you can feel your words, and they can be solid, and then you're okay, or as okay as you can be. And so, you know, okay, so.
Or as Donald Trump says, Rosie O'Donnell, what a fat pig, right? What a fat pig. Did you see his video about him talking about Ozempic?
No.
Oh my God.
No.
Oh, this will cure any depression. I would say get rid of the Xanax and go watch. It just surfaced. I was in bed sick the other day and I just cried laughing. He's talking about a friend of his who's on Ozempic. And he's like, you know, I have this friend, he's a billionaire, right? And he takes the fat shot drug, right? The fat shot drug. And he's in London. He says, it costs $12. I'm here getting the fat drug, the fat shot, and it costs $1,300 in the US. And he's calling Ozempic the fat shot. And I just thought, that's the funniest thing I've ever heard in my life.
He's very underestimated as a comedian.
He's starting to get the credit, I think.
I think
now.
he is. I think he
Yeah.
is. He's very funny in a Bill Burr sort of way.
In a just he
When
just-
Bill Burr was particularly funny.
right, when he was a little funnier, right? Now it's talking about Black Lives Matter, right? You know, these white guys, these Jordan Petersons, right? These pseudo intellects, right? On a Monday doing the podcast. Now he's brutal, right? He's always getting gum off his fingers, right? What is he doing? What is he, tickling a child? No, it's brutal. It's brutal. No, I used to love Bill.
Yeah.
That was one of the first I did. Bill Burr.
That was good. That was good. Oh, you know that.
I did a Bill Burr master class. I did the whole prosthetic bald thing, and it was him teaching young comedians how to do comedy, and he just would lose his cool, you know, and just grab the microphone from him. So I booked a studio like this. You know, that was one of the blessings of, I guess, being not getting an agent and all that stuff, was I had to just make my own stuff.
Yeah, you had more freedom.
Yeah, so that was one of the first, was the Bill Burr teaching kids.
Show me some more.
Oh God. What else do I do? All right, this is Owen Wilson. You know Owen
Yeah.
Wilson? Owen Wilson, if he was a dog. Okay. Bow wow. That's it.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, that's good.
it. That's one
good.
I would call my stupidest joke,
Yeah.
but works better than almost anything I do. And
Yeah, well, I think it works because, well, it's certainly not too long.
It's very
They say brevity is the soul of wit, right? But that you had the mannerisms and you got the voice dead on.
Sure.
So it's worth the apprehension, and it pays off, even though it's a very small dose.
And it's what I grew up on. I think I definitely turned very bitter from all the stuff happening in the world and stuff. You know, I'm sure I've seen you go through ebbs and flows of being softer, and interviews where I could tell you're, you know, a little more hard. But I do want to get back to that silly, you know, just silly physical comedy, you know, stuff everybody can laugh at.
Yeah.
I had to go in really hard on all the stuff, the wokeism and all that stuff. And that'll be a gift that is laid out forever.
It's nice to be able to do things with a sense of play.
Yeah.
That's the optimal state, if you can manage that.
That's also,
Even with serious things. That's hard.
it's a good test of when I do have the courage to approach a person of the opposite sex to ask them for coffee before getting dragged away by security. I am testing for playfulness.
Yeah.
You know, I'll always do something a little playful, a little silly, and see if they recoil or if they play along a bit.
Right.
Yesterday I went and I just...
Right. Well, that's why little boys and little girls play together, you know, so that they can learn how to play together.
And I'm stuck in this little boy body here.
So let's see some more impressions if you're inclined.
More,
yeah.
Well, what else do? I do the what you remember when Mitch McConnell he froze up when he was talking.
Yeah.
So I do a joke about our politicians are so old, no one even notices when they have strokes, because he really froze for a while. He's doing and the fellow vice and I'll hold that for about 10 minutes on stage. I'll just hold it until people stop laughing.
That's 1/9 of the whole set.
That's the Mitch. I'm very dedicated. 20 minutes is me as Biden trying to get up the stairs. I just do it in real time.
So now you said that you're not scripting your sets.
I used to have a set list right on, and I'd go boom, 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 boom.
Yeah.
Because I had never done a full hour. You do these comedy club sets that are 10 to 15 minutes.
Right.
With 10
right.
people.
90. You're doing 90 minutes now.
Sometimes I'll do 90, 80 to 90.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And it also helps me rely on myself and not have someone go out there and warm up the crowd.
Mm-hmm. Right, you have to warm up your own crowd.
I have to warm
Are you
up
getting
my own
better at it?
Yeah.
What are you learning?
Well, you go out and you might just, feel what the energy is.
Yeah.
And sometimes they're rustling around, and the other night I just got a vacuum from backstage, and I just vacuumed the crowd for 5 minutes.
Oh, yeah.
Until they settled down.
Until they focused.
And
you know, one of the things I tell speakers is not to start speaking until everyone is silent. right? Because if you start speaking before they're silent, you've given them permission to rustle around and talk.
Right.
So you wait. And if you wait, everyone will go silent, partly because they're wondering what the hell's going on.
Yeah.
Right? Because they're expecting you to start. So you just wait. Then it's dead silent. Then you wait a little longer because you want people thinking, what the hell's going on here? Then they're paying attention. Then you go. That's
Right.
much better.
And I saw you do that at the Beacon. And as a comedian, you might go, I liked what Jordan did. You know what? I'm going to hold it for 10 more seconds. And maybe I'll walk off.
Yeah. Yeah, well, Man in the Moon, who was that? Kaufman.
Andy Kaufman.
Kaufman.
Yes.
He would do that.
Yes.
On live TV, right? Hold that silence till the producers were willing to pull the plug, and then he'd start. Yeah.
He definitely influenced me quite a bit.
It takes a lot of confidence to do that, to hold that silence.
If you take a risk like that up top, though, the crowd also might trust you and go, geez, that guy's got some balls.
Yeah.
You know, we might be a little more submissive now.
Well, the crowd wants to know. The crowd is hoping that there's a reason they're there paying attention to you. And if you don't think that there's a reason, if you're not in control, and I don't mean command, I mean if you're not orchestrating the event, well, what the hell good are you? Right? I mean, you're the one that's point of focus, and so it's up to you to indicate some confidence.
You have to.
And some invitation.
What I learned to do, I think, was to stop saying things that made me weak. I mean, I'm still trying to do that because I'm always feeling when I talk whether or not the words that I'm saying are either making me align or making me come apart. I think alignment is the right way of conceptualizing it, because I think if you say things that are as true as you can say them, let's say, then they come out of the depths inside of you. Because we don't know where thoughts come from. We don't know how far down into your substructure the thoughts emerge. We don't know what processes of physiological alignment are necessary for you to speak from the core of your being. We don't understand any of that. We don't even conceptualize that, but I believe that you can feel that. I decided that I would start practicing not saying things that would make me weak. And what happened was that I had to stop saying almost everything that I was saying. I would say 95% of it. It's a hell of a shock to wake up and realize that, you know, and you might think, well, do you really want all of that to burn off? It's like, well, there's nothing left but a little husk, 5% of you. It's like, well, if that 5% is solid, then maybe that's exactly what you want to have happen. The issue is there are times in your life where you know that the thing that you're saying is not true. It's a deception. It's a lie of some sort, and you're using it to manipulate yourself or another person or the world. And you're also possessed, fully possessed of the idea that you can get away with it. Where are you once you destroy your own ideal? What's left for you? There's nowhere to go. There's no up. And when there's no up, there's a lot of down. If you destroy your own ideal, which you do with jealousy and resentment and the desire to pull down people who you would like to be, let's say, then you end up in a situation that's indistinguishable from hell. Your moral degeneration contributes in no small way to the degeneration of the entire cosmos. Stop cheating at whatever game it is that you've chosen to play. That's a good start, and that'll straighten out your life. Just exactly what are your motives? If you're not doing something important with your life, maybe you're prone to cause trouble just because you don't have anything better to do. Because at least trouble is more interesting than boring. And so if you're not doing something, if you're not pushing yourself to the limits of your capacity, then you have plenty of leftover willpower, energy, and resources to devote to causing interesting trouble. There are so many things that need doing that all you really have to do is open your eyes and look at them and then decide that you're actually going to do something about them. And you might think, well, what's within my scope of influence is so trivial that it's not worth doing. It's like, it won't stay trivial for long if you do it. Not at all. And I don't think it's trivial to begin with. I really don't believe that anything done right is trivial. And my experience in my life has been that anything I actually did paid off. It didn't pay off necessarily in the way that I expected it to pay off. That's a whole different story. But if it was genuine commitment to do something, even if it went sideways and the outcome was really something other than what I expected, the net consequence over time was nothing but good. So every new frontier that can be conquered is an advance forward, and there's no shortage of frontier because we're surrounded by the unknown. We're surrounded by our own ignorance, and that's the secret to proper being. If you're interested in life, if you're interested in proper being, and you're disinclined to produce any more suffering than necessary, then you want to know how to conduct yourself when the catastrophe comes so that you have a reasonable possibility of moving through it. If you dare to do the most difficult thing that you can conceptualize, your life will work out better than it will if you do anything else. Well, how are you going to find out if that's true? Well, it's a Kierkegaardian leap of faith. There's no way you're going to find out whether or not that's true unless you do it. So no one can tell you either. You have to be all in this game. There is no more effective way of operating in the world than to conceptualize the highest good that you can and then strive to attain it. There's no better pathway to self-realization and the ennoblement of being than to posit the highest good that you can conceive of and commit yourself to it. You can take whatever job you have and you can make it a real nice little piece of absolute misery. Or you can act like a civilized human being and notice that no matter where you are, there's a richness and a complexity that's completely inexhaustible right at hand. And then you can take that seriously and you can say, well, I can make it a lot better if I want to. I can get along properly with my coworkers and not gossip behind their back, and I can treat my customers properly. And if an opportunity comes my way, I can take it and I can see what happens. I started to talk to you about trait theory, and now I'm going to make a jump to biology. And that's a strange jump in some sense because the two levels of analysis are relatively disconnected. But what's happening right now at the sort of outer echelons of personality research is that the workers at the forefront of the field are trying to integrate what's being established at the statistical level of analysis with what's known at the psychobiological level. And so this emerging science is known as personality neuroscience, and it's developed in a rather strange way because the traits that were identified that I discussed with you on Tuesday, the big 5 traits, all emerged as a consequence of the statistical analysis of descriptors, characteristic mostly of the English language, although it's been duplicated in other languages. So, in some sense, it was an atheoretical model, right? It just came out of the linguistic data. So there was no real initial inferences about brain area or neurological activity or anything like that to drive the formulation of the Big 5 model. Instead, the Big 5 model came first, and then people started thinking, okay, can this be put into alignment with what we know about the brain? And so people have been hitting that pretty hard, I would say, over about the last, it's probably 30 years, something like that, because Hans Eysenck and his student Jeffrey Gray were pretty far along on this kind of thinking by, say, 1982, when Gray published his book, The Neuropsychology of Anxiety, which the paper you're reading now, A Model of the Limbic System and Basal Ganglia, Applications to Anxiety and Schizophrenia. That's a very short summary of the book that Gray published in 1982, which has been incredibly influential. If you're interested in going on in psychology, especially on the scientific end, but I would say pretty much regardless, if you're interested in going on in psychology, that's a very useful book to tackle. There's a newer version. It was published by Gray and McNaughton in, I think, 2000, something like that. It's hard going. And you may have found the paper that way too. Gray was a very, very, unfortunately he died a few years ago. He was a very, very smart person. And he knew the animal literature on behavior, neuroanatomy, and neuropsychopharmacology inside out and backwards. And so whenever he defined a term, he always made sure that the term was intelligible at a behavioral level and at an anatomical level and at a pharmacological level. It had to You know, the ideas that he were developing had to make sense at these multiple levels of analysis before he would accept them as genuine. And Gray did a remarkable job of extending our knowledge of the biological and evolutionary basis of at least the first two personality traits, say extroversion and neuroticism, roughly corresponding to positive and negative emotion. So, so that's partly why you're reading Gray. And Gray's theory is also cybernetic theory. Cybernetic theory is a variation of a theory developed by an MIT cognitive scientist named Norbert Wiener, who was an early AI, artificial intelligence researcher, and he proposed that intelligent entities were goal-directed and that they organized their behavior around reducing deviations from a goal while they were approaching it once they had decided what it would be. And that's also proved to be incredibly influential. We'll talk a fair bit about cybernetic models as we progress. So Gray is sort of a combination of artificial intelligence, cybernetic theorizing, and then an incredible amount of data that's come in from animal behavioral research. And as far as I'm concerned, most of the things that we know about the brain have been derived from animal research. The animal researchers tended to be extraordinarily careful scientists. They were influenced by B.F. Skinner, who established the sort of the initial theoretical basis for understanding how animals learn. We'll talk about that a little bit next class. So anyways, that's the context within which Gray is working. Ledoux, these are all papers you're going to read except the third one, which is optional. Ledoux is also an emotional, he's an affective neuroscientist, so he's someone who studies emotions, mostly, again, animals. And Ledoux has done a lot to sort of add some of the pieces that were missing in Gray. Gray probably concentrated a little bit too much on a brain area called the hippocampus, which is the brain area that sort of lets you know if it's reasonable to be calm where you're currently situated. And so what the hippocampus does in some sense is compare what it is that you want to have happen with what is happening, and if the two things are the same, then you're calm. So it's a match-mismatch detector, and it has access not only to memory, but also to formulations of, say, the desired future. Swanson, I had people read the Swanson paper last year. I put it in your reading list as optional. It's worth hacking through if you can manage it. It's a very hard paper, though, which is why I took it out of the required reading list. The reason I like Swanson, we're going to talk a fair bit about him today, is Swanson's not a psychologist. He's actually a developmental I can never say this properly. He studies developmental anatomy. We'll do that. And so he's very interested in how the brain unfolds across time during embryonic development and then up into maturity. And so he understands the brain differently than a psychologist would, because a psychologist tends to analyze the brain, as a sort of mature thing, usually in adulthood. But for Swanson, it's a much more living and transforming system. And he's trying to set forth a schema for understanding brain anatomy and also associating that with function. And you might think that that's a well-advanced science already, that we know how to segment up the brain and we know, roughly what the pieces do, but we haven't even really managed to establish the terminology properly yet. It's neuroscience is a very new field, and there's no limit to the number of things that we don't know about it, including even the basic classification structure. Now, Swanson has put forth a very intelligent basic classification structure, and part of the reason that I think it's so relevant to a personality class is because it maps in a beautiful way onto some of the things that we've already talked about, especially Piaget. So there's a nice direct mapping of Piaget's developmental theory onto Swanson's theory of neurodevelopment and then of neural function. And that's completely accidental, because Swanson never cites Piaget, so they're non-overlapping literatures. And I kind of like that, because if something pops up in one place with one method and pops up another place with a completely different method, especially if those two places are distinct in terms of their historical development, you might start thinking there's actually something there. You know, it's sort of like seeing something and hearing it at the same time. You got two independent sources of data. It's like triangulation in a sense. And so it was very exciting to me to come across this paper by Swanson. I think he's one of only two scientists I ever wrote a fan letter to. I mean, really, it's a brilliant paper. And then there's other reasons why it maps onto what we're going to talk about too, because Swanson also points out quite clearly the function of the, he kind of roughly separates the hypothalamus into two halves, and he points out that they have quite distinct functions, and the functions also map onto some of the things that we've been talking about in a very lovely way. And so there's a lot of reasons to go through Swanson's paper carefully. You know, it's like 50 pages long, but the guy put it, in some sense, his whole life's work is in those 50 pages. So, you know, even if it takes you 12 hours or 20 hours to read it, it's like, that's not too bad if you're going to extract out like 30 years of solid research. Gray's book is the same. Like, if you read that book, you've got, if you read it and understand it, you've basically got a fair chunk of neuroanatomy, a lot of animal behavioral analysis, so behaviorism in general, a lot of psychopharmacology, and a lot of understanding of the functional significance of the brain's major neurotransmitter systems. You can get all that from Gray's book. That's a killer book, you know, if you can extract all that out. So anyways, Carver and Shire also take a cybernetic perspective. Fundamentally, they're more cognitive scientists. You're going to find their paper a little bit farther down the road. But they're also very interested in how creatures, human beings in particular, select goals and then align themselves with those goals. And for our purposes, we're going to talk a fair bit about motivation today. And the distinction between motivation and emotion is not clear. They're both words that sort of function within a linguistic context. But for the sake of argument, and of course all the emotions aren't the same. It's not like there's one circuit that subsumes emotion. There's multiple circuits that subsume emotion, and they're not identical circuits, you know. So it isn't like every emotion is a variant of the same thing. It's not, and it's the same with the motivation. So they're very loose groupings, motivation and emotion. But for the purposes of our argument, we're going to make this case. Roughly, motivations set goals, and roughly, emotions orient you in relationship to those goals. Now, like I said, those categories overlap. Anger is usually considered an emotion, and it often has a goal, right? The goal is to hit something or hurt something. That's one possible goal. So emotions can segue quite easily into motivational states, but whatever. You got to use a category system of some sort to clarify things, and so that's what we're going to pursue. Motivation set goals. It's actually more complicated than that. You know, I showed you that little oval diagram with you know, desired future and unbearable present, so to speak. Motivations actually don't just set goals. They also prime behavior, and they also set up the perceptual frame within which you interpret the world. So for example, if you're hungry, it isn't just that you're driven to eat. First of all, eating is a very complex behavior, especially if it's associated with food preparation, say. The systems that you've used in the past to procure food and then to ingest it are sort of disinhibited by the motivational state, so they're at the ready. And then your sensory system is tuned so that it's going to focus on those things that are relevant to eating and tune out everything else. So the motivational state also does perceptual tuning. And then there's a felt component of it as well. So it's not reasonable to only say that motivation sets goals or that it drives behavior. It does three things: goal setting, behavioral driving, plus it provides a perceptual schema within which those other two things make sense. And so a motivated state in some sense is like a little micro-personality. It's only got one aim. It's sort of a one-eyed micro-personality, you know. So it's only aiming at one thing, but it still has all the other aspects of personality. So sort of, you know, for me that aligns nicely with the psychoanalytic idea that, you know, you're a loose aggregation of multiple fragmented personalities. You know, they're sort of coherently tied together at the highest level of analysis, but they can go off and do their own thing. You see that in situations, for example, like eating disorders, where the hunger system itself starts to become almost a spun off part of the personality, and the rest of the personality then wars with that. And that's sort of, in some sense, that's like cortex versus hypothalamus, and you never win. Cortex does not win over hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is what keeps you alive. So it's one of the things that keeps you alive. You could do without your cortex, but you cannot do without your hypothalamus. And the connections stretching upwards from the hypothalamus, which is a very old brain area, are much more powerful than the connections coming down from the cortex to modulate the hypothalamus. And that's another indication of just exactly who's in charge when the chips are down. You know, and that's why it's so hard for you to override your basic emotions or motivational states. It's like the system evolved to keep you alive, and it's not particularly willing to give up control, in a sense, given that your survival is staked on its function. So it's useful to know that, because, you know, if you pursue psychology and you stay within the human side of psychology, say, instead of wandering off into the animal behavioral research, you'll see that most human psychologists and neuropsychologists are very corticocentric. They really like to think that it's the newly evolved parts of the brain that are in charge, and that's just not right. The newly evolved parts of the brain are in charge only when nothing is bothering you. Like, if you're not hungry, you're not thirsty, you're not too excited, you're not too curious, you're not too terrified, you know, you're not too cold, you're not too warm, any of those, then the cortex is in charge. But if you deviate substantially across any of those dimensions, the probability that control over your behavioral output and your perceptions is going to devolve down the evolutionary hierarchy to more primordial brain areas is extremely likely. You know, and you see the same thing happens, you know, maybe you're having a discussion with someone, right? And they exhaust the limits of your rational knowledge, which means basically they out-argue you. Well, what happens? Well, usually what happens is that people cry or they get angry. And it's like they're out of cortex, it's bang, right down to the lower and more primary evolutionarily determined systems. So, okay, now, we're gonna take a look at how the brain functions in general. And so we're gonna start pretty general, and then we're gonna go narrow. And the first thing that you might want to think about is, what problem exactly is the brain wrestling with? And the major problem is that reality is so complicated, it has so many layers and so many interconnected causal links that it's complex beyond comprehension. And that's a big problem. I mean, you think about all the subatomic complexity, that's a horrible thing. Then there's the complexity at the atomic level, and that's, you know, pretty overwhelming. And then there's the molecular level, which makes the atomic level look simple. And then there's all the exceedingly complex structures that emerge out of the molecular level, especially in living organisms. So that would be roughly at the organ level of existence, you know. And then there's you as a totality with your brain, and the brain is so much more complex than everything else in the universe that it's not even in the same category. So there are estimates, for example, by Gerard Edelman, that there are more connections in your brain, more patterns of connections in your brain than there are subatomic particles in the universe. So, you know, that's one major league complex thing, and there's lots of them around, and, you know, they're all integrated into families, and then, you know, roughly tribal groupings, some of which get large enough to be nations, and then that's all embedded inside of some biological system, and so on and so forth, all the way out to the limits of the cosmos. I mean, this is one complicated place, and, you know, your job in large part is to understand it, but also not to become overwhelmed by it, because you have to simplify it down to the point where you can sort of think about one thing and do one thing. And so you have to screen all of that out so that the complexity doesn't overwhelm you when you're attempting to do anything simple, even to look at yourself in the mirror, which is also a very complicated thing to do. Part of the problem your brain is always facing is, what can I ignore? And the answer to that is, well, you need to ignore almost everything. And that's a problem, because, of course, it's not always obvious what's okay for you to ignore. You know, and that changes on you suddenly too, because, you know, because you have imperfect knowledge, you might think something's irrelevant and it turns out to be of critical importance. It's a deadly difficult problem. And so one of the ways that we solve this is we're actually pretty blind to to almost everything, you know. Our sensory input is limited by our physiological limitations, certainly. So there's like, in terms of vision, we only see a very small little slice of the whole electromagnetic spectrum, and it's the same with sounds. And you know, we can only touch things that are basically within our reach, and so that limits things substantially. And then there are also things we can't detect, like we're not very good at detecting, like we don't have the same ability that, say, is it platypuses and some fish can detect electromagnetic disturbances around them on their skin, and like there's senses that we don't have. So we're narrowed a fair bit by what it is that we're able to perceive. And we're actually narrowed in what we can perceive far more than anybody ever guessed. So I'm going to show you a little video here.
The monkey business illusion. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the ball. The correct answer is 16 passes. Did you spot the gorilla? For people who haven't seen or heard about a video like this before, about half miss the gorilla. If you knew about the gorilla, you probably saw it, but did you notice the curtain changing color or the player on the black team leaving the game? Let's rewind and watch it again. Here comes the gorilla, and there goes a player, and the curtain is changing from red to gold. When you're looking for a gorilla, you often miss other unexpected events. And that's the monkey business illusion. Learn more about this illusion and the original gorilla experiment at theinvisiblegorilla.com.
So how many of you saw the gorilla? Well, no, let's do it the other way. See the gorilla. Okay. How many of you had known about this video beforehand? Yeah, the gorilla part of it. Yeah, so you guys don't count. Now and then, you know, I get someone who's seen it before and they still miss the damn gorilla, so that's pretty funny. So, but of course, Dan Simon set this up because his original video got so popular, you know, virally popular, that everybody has seen the invisible gorilla. And so, you know, now he's showing you that, well, you think you're smart, you've been clued into how blind you are, and it turns out you're not any smarter than you were to begin with, right? So how many people saw all three things that changed?
I saw the video before, though.
Oh, you've seen it before. So, okay, and how many didn't? Yeah, okay, so the vast majority of you missed one or more of the things that changed. You know, and they're not really trivial things, like the disappearance of a person from 6 people, that's fairly major, and, you know, the whole background changed color, and you might think you'd clue into that. And so the weird thing is, even when you're primed to notice what you're supposed to notice, which is to say count the balls, and you know that something weird is going to happen, that still doesn't prime you enough so that you can keep track of all the weird things that are happening. And like, this was an absolutely staggering experiment when it was first shown. The psychologists were just like knocked over by it, because the hypothesis up to that point had been always that, you know, you could concentrate on what you were concentrating on, but if something anomalous or unexpected happened, your attention would be automatically devoted towards it. And of course, that's what people would think, right? You'd think that if you're watching people play basketball and a gorilla walks into the, you know, area and it's not small, that of course you'd be surprised and you'd see it. And it turns out that that's just wrong. And, you know, it tells you a lot about how your nervous system is set up. So you're focusing on counting the balls. And so for some reason, getting the correct answer to the question, how many times is the ball thrown back and forth, turns out to be motivationally significant. Why? Like, why did you got the instructions, fair enough, but why did you listen to them?
Does it narrow your attention to the target?
Oh, sure it does, but the question is, why did you even comply with the instructions?
Because you want to get the answer right?
Yeah, who said that? because you wanted to get the answer right. Why did you care if you got the answer right? Well, think about it for a minute. Like, guess.
That means you're smart?
Means you're smart. Yeah, that's right. So that's one possibility. It's like instantly you sort of interpret it as a little cognitive test, maybe, and then you want to see if you can do it, and so that taps into your hierarchy of values. Part of your value is I want to be maybe a smart and competent person, or I want to be at least as smart and competent as everyone else is playing this game. And so, the instruction taps into a pre-existent value structure, and then it's motivating. Okay, so yeah. What, compliance as well? Yes, that's another thing. It's like the room in some ways is set up to ensure a degree of compliance, right? Because there's an implicit story in the room, which is if I'm at the front of it, and so that sort of makes me at the top of the dominance hierarchy, and the fact that you're here means you've already bought into that presupposition, and so it's a logical thing to do to play along with the game. So, yes.
Or it can also be that, like, when you're curious about what could happen if you get the answer right. 'Cause maybe
True, that's more like the playing a game issue, right? Is that, well, maybe something interesting will happen. Okay, right. Okay, so there's a variety of reasons why you might listen to the instructions, but the point is the instructions actually tap into your motivation, in your intrinsic motivation enough, so that you will in fact attempt to play the game. And then as soon as you play the game, what happens? Well, you focus your very limited attentional resources precisely on what it is that you're supposed to do. Now, we could talk a little bit about how the visual field is set up. So, you notice that, like, if I'm looking around the room, if I want to see you, all of you, I can't just stand here and look straight ahead. Because all you people over here, you're like, I can't see, if I'm looking straight ahead, I can't see the faces of anyone past here. And I can only see them sort of as blurs, and unless they move. And if they move up something, then I can see the movement, but I can't, it's not clear to me what's moving. And it's the same for the people over here. The only person I can really see right now is the woman who's sitting there in the white sweater. All the rest of you are like, and the person to the right, I can more or less, as long as I look at her, I can more or less see that he's dressed in gray, but I can't see his face at all. Now he nodded his head and I could pick that up. So what's very strange about your visual system, and your sensory systems are like this all your sensory systems are like this, is that you have a tiny little point of focus where the information is rich, and that's partly because, so the center of your eye is the fovea, and it's most densely packed with cells, but more importantly, each of the cells in your fovea, which is the very center of your vision, you can tell when someone's pointing their fovea at you, because then you have the sense that they're looking at you, and human beings are unbelievably good at figuring out when someone is pointing their fovea at you. We can detect what would you call it? Deviation from direct gaze with an accuracy that's absolutely remarkable. Now each of those little cells in the fovea is connected, each of the one cells is connected to like 20,000 cells at the first level of the hierarchy of the visual system. And so the reason that your whole eye isn't fovea is because your head would have to be this big to manage it. So, what's evolved is sort of a compromise, is that in the center of your vision, the center of your vision is very, very detailed. And then what you do is you zip that center around, like snap, 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 and your brain sort of makes a amalgamated picture out of all those little snapshots. And then it weaves it together so it seems to you like it's a continuous movie of consciousness, even though it's really not. And then the sides of your eyes, the periphery of your eyes, well, they don't have the same potency as the fovea. And so they kind of play a triage game. It's like, okay, I can't see, if I'm looking straight ahead, I can't see everything. What might I use as an indication that I should move my gaze from where I'm looking to somewhere else? And one answer to that is movement. So the periphery is pretty good at picking up movement. And so often if you see movement in the periphery, then you'll move your foveal vision to where the movement was, and then, then you can keep track of what's changing. So what your brain sort of assumes is that when you're looking at something, everything else is irrelevant, and it also sort of fades into the background. And so that's what's happening with the gorilla video. And so part of the reason you can't see the damn gorilla is because he's dressed in black like the players. And so when you're focusing on the basketball, all the black moving things look the same. You know, there's no distinction between them at all. And then the background of the curtain, it's like, well, first of all, why would you be primed to see the curtain change color? Like, things just don't do that in real life, right? I mean, big objects don't suddenly change color, or very, very seldomly. So, and more importantly, the fact that the gorilla shows up, the fact that one player leaves, and the fact that the curtains change color has no bearing whatsoever on whether or not you can complete the task, right? So it doesn't matter if you ignore the information, and that's because it's irrelevant in terms of the interpretive frame, the motivated interpretive frame that you're applying to the scene. And so the rule for perception is don't pay attention to anything that isn't directly relevant to the desired outcome. Now, exactly how you calculate what you can pay attention to and what you can't, that's very complicated. It's, I mean, you build that knowledge bit by bit over time, and you can be wrong about it too. But so the old idea was, you know, well, first of all, that you were very much conscious of the environment, period, which you're not. And then the second idea was, well, while you're being conscious of the environment, if anything changes radically, you will definitely focus your attention on it. And what turned out to be the case is, well, you're not very conscious of the environment, and radical things can happen, and you won't notice them unless they interfere with what you're doing. So something that emerges, that interferes with what you're doing, that you don't expect, you will instantly orient towards and concentrate on. So it isn't anomaly or novelty that attracts your attention. It's the unexpected disruption of the relationship between your behaviors and the desired outcome of those behaviors. And that's a much narrower claim. Only pay attention to things that make you fail. It's something like that. Or at least additionally pay attention to things that make you fail. And, you know, generally speaking, that's also associated with an emotional response, you know. So if you're doing something and you know, you think you know how to do it, and so you're doing it, and then all of a sudden something unexpected happens, you're going to have an emotional reaction. And we'll talk more about the emotional reactions in the next class, but the emotional reaction partly prepares you for the worst in case this unexpected thing is bigger than you think it is, and sort of also primes you to be curious and to start to explore, to figure out what it is, so that you can reconstruct your expectations and desires in accordance with the transforming world. So this slide is an elaboration in some sense of what I was telling you a little bit earlier about the multiple levels of reality, you know. So the idea is that the thing that you see, which in this particular schema would be the computer, is nested inside all of these systems, or has other systems nested inside of it. And that's part of an indication of the complexity of things. Now, you know, one of the things that you might think about, for example, if you're using your computer, one of the things you might ask yourself is, like, why is your computer a black rectangle or like a silver rectangle? It's all smooth and shiny. Why is that? You know, like, it's not clear first, it's not transparent, okay, and then it's got this smooth cover, and it wouldn't necessarily have to. Why do you think that's appealing to you?
Because it's familiar for like a book.
Okay, so it's familiar, yeah, and that's good. So it's familiar. What else is? It's simple. Yeah, you don't want to interact with the computer at all. You want to interact with little pictures on the screen, and then you don't even really want to interact with those. You want to interact with some subset of what that picture is doing on the screen. And so you're very, very rarely using the computer, right? You're just paying attention to, well, let's say the screen and the keyboard. So the computer is whatever's underneath that, and then what that is a collection of parts that are so bloody complicated that you don't want to have anything to do with them, that are nested inside a whole network of things that are so complex you don't want to have anything to do with them. And so you know, what happens when you're using a computer is all of a sudden it stops working. Well, then it's a computer. As soon as it stops working, it's a computer. Before that, it was whatever it was you were doing. And as soon as it turns into a computer, what do you do with it? Well, you know, you stupidly hit the on and off button, and maybe you plug it in and you know, and out or something. Or maybe you check your switches to make sure that a fuse didn't burn out or a breaker go, and that's pretty much the end of you in terms of your ability to deal with the actual entity. You know, and then you curse with your primate brain, and then you send it out to be fixed. And so one of the things that's worth considering, because this will also help us understand what happens in terms of brain function as we go along, is that as long as things are going according to how you want them to go, you can really pretend that the world is unbelievably simple. All the world consists of is those few things that you're doing in your little bounded perceptual frame, and everything else is zero. And then, unfortunately, now and then, the hypothesis that everything else is zero is radically wrong, like when your computer crashes, and then you actually for a while have to deal with at least some of the complexity that's actually there, and that's usually extremely anxiety provoking. So, you know, you can imagine the same situation is while you're in your nice smooth car and you're on the highway, and all of a sudden, you know, you hear a horrible grinding noise and smoke comes out of the back, and you're off pulled over to the side. Well, what was merely a means of getting from point A to B in comfort, like 2 seconds ago, is now a collection of extremely troublesome parts, none of which you know anything about, plus it's disrupted your day, plus it's disrupted your pocketbook, plus you have to now deal with a bunch of people who are going to tell you what's wrong with your vehicle and maybe fix it for some completely unknown amount of money and with dubious utility. And so poof, the car turns into that. And so it's almost impossible to overestimate the degree to which we live within a world that's bounded by our expectations and desires, and how much time we spend keeping everything that's complex away from us so that we don't have to deal with it. Okay, so now we might want to think about how we do that. I'm going to show you, this is a little schema that might be helpful. So, like, I made this little diagram of dots because I wanted to make an ambiguous figure. So I'm hoping that when you look at that figure, what do you see when you look at it? The center. And what shape is the center? A cross. Okay, so you can see a cross. What else can you see? It's a rectangle. Yeah, what else can you see? It's 4 squares. Yeah, exactly. So, and what else can you see? 18 triangles within those 4 squares. Made up of dots. That's a good one. I haven't seen that one. I'll take your word for it, though. What else can you see? Well, I'll show you some of the things you can see, okay? You see that, right? You see that? See that? You can see that. You can see that. Okay, so the first thing that you might note is that the thing in the beginning, the thing in itself, let's say, you can see multiple ways. It's not exactly that you have an opinion about what it is. You know, it's that you can actually see those different things. You can see it manifesting those different perceptual objects. And that's a strange thing, because you know how people always think that arguments are about opinions. There's some facts, and you have one set of opinions about them, and you have another, and then you argue about the opinions till you get to the facts. Unfortunately, it's a lot worse than that, because the facts themselves are often reasonably subject to debate. So you might ask, for example, which of the 5 ways that you could see that initial thing is the right way to see it? And the answer to that, and this is a pragmatic answer, is it depends on what you want to do with your perception. You know, so if you want the highest resolution that captures as much detail as possible, then you want something as close to the thing in itself as possible. So that'd probably be object 5 there. You know, if you want to know the rough area, let's say that's a map of an orchard, you might think about object 1. If it's an orchard from the top, right, and you want it to walk from north to south, you might want to think about it in terms of object 3. You know, and so those are different ways you can perceive that object. And then I would say that what happens at the next level of abstraction, and that's where you've got the numbers and words down here, is that you have the thing in itself, which is complex and can be seen many ways. Then you have the things you see, which are partial, sort of low resolution representations of the thing itself. And then there are words which are, at least in part, references to the image of the thing. And so by the time you get to the word, it's pretty compressed. And I really like the metaphor of compression, you know, so, because a lot of the things you see are sort of like thumbnails. And why are thumbnails useful? You guys have done some, you know, image processing, say. Like, obviously a thumbnail lacks some things that a 16 megabyte, is that about right now? How big are cameras? 16 megabytes for a single photo? What's that? Yeah, well, I think the new cameras are up, I think they're up to 16, the newest iteration. So, okay, so why have thumbnail if you have a 16 megabyte picture? Okay, but why not use the picture? Because then it takes more time. Right, that's exactly it. Is that there's a trade-off between detailed representation and time utilization, time and resource utilization. And you know, like a computer, you guys have limited time and resources, and so you don't actually want to see any more than you need to see in order to get what you're supposed to get done. Because otherwise it's just a waste of energy. And so what that means is that your brain is always trying to figure out, in some sense, what's the simplest way I can represent this so that I can undertake whatever it is that I'm planning to undertake next. And that's sort of, again, from a philosophical perspective, that's actually something pragmatic. Okay, so then you might ask yourself, you organize your perceptions in relationship to your goals, and then you might ask yourself, well, where do those goals come from? You know, and we've heard from thinkers like, say, Freud, who talked about the id functions, and the id is sort of the seat of primordial impulses, right? And so you might think about the id as the producer of primary goals or drives, and Freud did think about them as drives, so they were things that led to, you know, a relatively rigid behavioral algorithm once the state had arisen. Now, as I mentioned before, I think that that's a flawed viewpoint, because the motivational state is more than merely a drive, because a drive is something that, say, triggers a pre-programmed sequence of behaviors. And a lot of the early behaviorists thought about animal behavior in that way, right? They'd say the animal would encounter a stimulus, and the stimulus would produce a response, and then the responses would get chained together, and then when the animal encountered the stimulus again, then just those chained responses would automatically run. And one of the famous experiments that showed that that was wrong was a rat was trained to run through a maze. You can sort of train a rat pretty quickly if, you know, you put him in the maze and there's like, he can go this way or this way, and you put some cheese over here. You do that 3 or 4 times, the rat learns to turn right. And then you add another piece to the maze, and, you know, then the rat learns to turn left, and so you can get it turning, you know, in an extremely complicated way to walk through the maze. But then what they did was they took a rat, and they wrapped up its hind legs, you know, like with tape, so it couldn't use them, and then they put its little rear end on a cart, and then they had the little rat scoot through the maze on the cart. And it's obvious that a scooting rat and a running rat don't use the same motor output, not even close, and the rat could still get through the maze. So the idea that all the rat had done was chain together learned automatic responses turned out to be wrong. Rats, it's more like rats learn what's going on and can generalize from it just like you do. So anyway, so the notion that the drive just instantiates a sequence of pre-programmed behaviors, in most cases, in many cases, especially with complex behavior, turns out to be wrong. There's some limited circumstances under which it's right. Okay, so the first hypothesis we're going to entertain is the idea that you have to frame the world in order to interact with it. And this is sort of a little mythological diagram that I whipped up a long time ago. And the bottom thing, that's an Ouroboros, by the way, which is a dragon that eats its own tail. It's an ancient symbol of chaos. And chaos is what you see when you don't know what you're looking at. And so you could say, in some sense, chaos is all the complexity that surrounds you that could possibly intrude on your little safe world. And then to grasp that chaos or to operate within it, you have to put it within a framework. And so that's the great father there, that's actually God. You see, and God's got the sun behind him because God is like the sun. he's you know, reliable, and he's associated with consciousness, and then he's sort of ruling over this city. And so for me, that was a good symbol of culture. And in part, culture is what's outside of you, but in part, culture is also the frameworks that you've learned to use by being with other people, the frameworks that you've learned to use to narrow and specify the world. And in my mode of thinking, the framing is associated with security on the one hand, because it tells you what you can do and, you know, makes things safe for you, and tyranny on the other hand, because it can get out of control and, you know, it can start to get too rigid. Whatever. Regardless of the pros and cons of framing, if you see something one way, then you can't see it another. It's harder to see it another. So that's the con side of framing. The pro side of framing is, well, then you get to do something. If it's unframed, you're in chaos. It's existential anxiety. You're not going to move ahead at all. So you have to frame things. You have to simplify them. And really, in some sense, you even have to oversimplify them. It depends on what you mean by that. But what you're really trying to do is to never make your perceptual task any more complex than it has to be in order to get done what you need to get done. So, how do you frame things? Well, the first thing we should point out is that a lot of framing doesn't even happen psychologically. Right? So here you are sitting in this classroom, and you're not overwhelmed by chaos. Well, why? Well, first of all, you're in a city. That's helpful. There's electricity here, and there's natural gas, and there's people to fix all the plumbing. And so the fact that you're in a city makes life much simpler right off the bat. There's nothing trying to eat you. You don't have to contend with the fact that it's like -20 for 3 months. And, you know, so that's a whole bunch of complexity that the civilized world has just taken care of for you. And then, you know, now you're in the university in the city, and that eliminates a whole bunch of other hassles, you know. There's some things you have to do, but there's a bunch of things you don't have to do. And then you're inside this building, and, well, look at that. There's electric light here, and, you know, and the chairs work, and there's not going to be an earthquake, and probably the whole building isn't going to fall down. So, you know, by the time you're sitting in your chair here, also with your clothing on, you've screened a lot of complexity out already, and so you can sit there fairly calmly. And so that's all external. Now, part of the reason, and this is worth thinking about, because this isn't only psychological. You guys will hear a fair bit about terror management theories as you progress through your education. And so terror management theories are theories that attempt to account for why people are, say, patriotic in their beliefs, why they adopt belief systems. And the idea is that a belief system protects you from death anxiety. And so Freud sort of said that about religious systems. That was his critique of religion. People are afraid of death, and so they have this infantile desire to have that fear go away, so they turn to religion, and religion says, well, death isn't permanent, and that's why people are religious. And the extension of that is, well, that's also why they have belief systems in general. They're trying to protect themselves against this deep, shaking anxiety. And to some degree, I suspect that's true. But you should also remember that when you're protecting your culture, say, if you identify with it, you're patriotic or whatever it is, or you think that your culture is worth defending, you're not just defending something psychological. It's like the culture, the functioning culture keeps the lights on. You know, so it doesn't just protect you from death anxiety. It also protects you from death. And that's even more important most of the time than being protected from death anxiety. Now, there's a psychological component to it too, but you don't ever want to underestimate just the practical utility of being nested inside, you know, what Piaget would consider a relatively functional game. It's like, your world's a lot simpler. You know, you have to work to maintain it and everything, and that's kind of a drag, maybe. That's the tyrannical element of it, but, you know, the payoff's pretty big. Okay, so if you look at medieval cities, this is a well-preserved medieval city in France. There's a lot of medieval cities that still exist in Europe. And you see, this is a typical sort of human habitation. It's like, inside there's order, and outside there's chaos and barbarians, and then there's a couple of walls to keep the chaos and the barbarians out, and then inside, you know, there's a dominance hierarchy, and everybody can live their relatively productive and relatively peaceful lives inside of that. It's all framing, getting rid of complexity, unnecessary complexity. Same thing with houses, they do the same thing for you. And then social institutions do the same thing too. It's like, okay, this is it Kennedy there and Obama? I think so. This is part of the transition in power from George Bush to Obama. And, you know, that's a pretty scary thing to have the leader of your dominance hierarchy replaced by another leader. And, you know, among chimpanzees, for example, that's often the occasion for a fair bit of mayhem. And it's also the case often for people that occurs. And, you know, we still have that in the form of political corruption and so on. But all things considered, you know, the power transition from Bush to Obama was far more peaceful than such power transitions generally are if you look across the history of mankind. And so that means you're also protected by your social institutions. They screen out a lot of potential complexity as well, as long as they're functional, and also I think as long as they follow some of the Piagetian rules. And so one of the Piagetian rules for a playable game is there's some reciprocity. You know, you regard the system, roughly speaking, as either fair or fairer than any other system you can think up. You know, it boils down to the same thing, because if it's not fair but you can't come up with a better fantasy, well, it's as good as it can be. So the sociological or sociopolitical structures that keep complexity away from us can only operate under a certain limited number of constraints, but still they perform their function, you know, and very admirably. It's amazing, I think, because I see people in my clinical practice all the time, you know, and most people that I see, and I think this is true of most people in the world, have at least one serious problem. You know, and it might be they have an illness that's just god-awful, or if they don't have an illness, one of their immediate family has an illness that's god-awful, or they're really old and they need to be taken care of, or they're suffering from some insane economic problem, or they've just been unemployed, or whatever. You know, there's something in their immediate circle that's really, really difficult to grapple with, and yet people still go out and maintain their place in the world, and the whole thing roughly works. And to me, that's just a continual source of amazement that people can pull that off, you know. So anyway, so a lot of the screening that you do to get rid of that complexity is external, and part of that is a consequence of good, well-functioning sociological organization. Then the next thing that sort of screens things out for you is your body, right? Now look, you kind of naturally see things at a particular level of resolution, right? There's no obvious reason why that should be. So, you know, you see the front of people, you can't see the back of them. You see their external covering, their skin and their clothes. You can't see inside them. When you look closely at them, you can't see their cellular structure or their molecular structure or their atomic structure. You can't really see the social situations that they're embedded in. So if I look at you, I can't see your family. I presume you have one. I can't really see the political situation that surrounds you either. I have to know that abstractly, and then the ecological level is almost completely imperceptible to me. And so part of the way that complexity is screened out is that your body just doesn't allow you to pick a lot of it up. You're just blind to it. So you see at one level of resolution, and that's the human level. You see things of approximately our size. You see things that are approximately the size that we can grip. Those are sort of the things that you're likely to think of as objects. Like clearly a mountain isn't exactly an object, you know, so usability is part of what defines perceptibility. And so that also screens things out. And so then you're left with, well, what it is that you have to deal with once everything's been screened out. And then you might ask, well, there's still a lot of complexity left there. Like there's plenty of complexity within the average family. And there's plenty of complexity in the mating domain, you know, to find a partner and to establish a reasonable long-term relationship and to have children and to raise them. There's plenty of complexity left. And then the question is, how did biology come to solve those problems, given that they're almost infinite in complexity? How can you do it? And the answer to that is fundamentally a Darwinian answer. You start simple, so that's back in the days of the one-celled organisms. We have no idea how those things got their start, right? I mean, the actual beginning of life is a serious mystery. And I'll tell you, it's such a serious mystery, this is completely unbelievable, but one of the people who discovered DNA, I think it was Francis Crick, in fact, I'm virtually certain it was, he actually believed that DNA came from an alien civilization. He wrote a whole book about that. It's called panspermia, and so he posited that it's possible for DNA to drift through space for millions of years and to land on planets and to start living. And that God only knows how old DNA is, because he just couldn't figure out at all how it could have possibly evolved. So scientists are a lot weirder than you think when you start to read, you know, about what the scientists who discover things really thought. They're completely, you know, out of their mind. But whatever, we'll assume that DNA got there somehow, and then evolution took over after that. And so what does evolution do? It basically says, well, here's a terribly complex problem that we've sort of partially solved. And partially solved means we've lived long enough to produce another copy of ourselves. That constitutes the solution. That's it. So we've lived long enough so that we can conceivably duplicate ourselves. How should we do that? Well, a variety of different ways. That's the answer. We should produce variants. So that might be multiple offspring, or it might also be facilitated by random mutation. Hypothetically, the mutations are random. Although there's increasing evidence, by the way, that organisms are much more complex at the genetic level than anyone ever assumed. And bacteria, for example, swap DNA back and forth with other bacteria all the time. And there are experiences that you can have that will change your genetic structure sufficiently so that you will transmit that to your children. So, you know, the idea that everything's purely Darwinian and it's only mutation that drives randomness, that's clearly likely, but not complete. These other mechanisms are clearly there. But the issue is that what you do is you start with something that kind of works, and then you produce microvariants of it, and then the world around you changes a little bit, and hopefully one of those microvariants manages to do the same thing, and then it produces a bunch of microvariants, and then they manage to do the same thing. And so what's happening is there's an arms race between the environment, which is always changing, and the organisms that are trying to keep up with it, and that arms race just goes on forever, and you know, different life forms proliferate as that occurs. It's sort of like life is always playing catch up, and you never get it right. You cannot get it right. The best you can do is get it right long enough to live long enough to reproduce. That constitutes the sum total of your knowledge. So what that means, at least in part, is that you guys are all the beneficiary, let's say, of a evolutionary process that's basically been going on since the beginning of life, and that's about 3.5 billion years ago. And so your body, your psychophysiology, has been in an arms race with the transforming environment for 3.5 billion years trying to keep up, and poof, you're the stellar consequence of 3.5 billion years of like effort and death. So, you know, you might thank the cosmos about that. You think about this, every single one of your female ancestors successfully reproduced. Like, it's mind-boggling. It's mind-boggling. You're so unlikely that you would be here that it's almost incalculable. So, good for us. Here we are, you know. How successful can you get? So, my point is that part of the way that complexity is dealt with is haphazard. It isn't ever really dealt with. That's why you die. You can only manage it to a limited degree. And for us, that's like 3 kids in 100 years, if you're lucky. And that's our knowledge after 3.5 billion years. So the complexity problem is a rough one. Okay, so that's your body. Now let's look inside your body. Now you might think that, you know, we have this sort of idea that's kind of leftover Cartesian, that there's a you and there's your body, and the you is in your brain. And so, just out of curiosity, how many of you have the subjective sense that the you is in your head? How many of you would locate you, like, for me, I can locate me somewhere, seems to be about there. I feel like that's where I am. And so, how many of people have like the center of their sense of subjectivity in their head? How many people are like that? Okay. How many people are different than that? Okay, so, oh good, okay, so where do you feel the center of your subjectivity? Where would it be?
That's hard to conceptualize, because like, I have like religious views, so I believe in the soul, and I believe that...
Oh, I was thinking more about how it feels. Fair enough, you know, that's perfectly reasonable. I'm thinking of it more as a subjective experience, though.
Then my brain.
Okay. So you're kind of located here? Yeah. How many people would agree with that? Oh yeah, so quite a few of you, eh? So that's the same for you? Here, I don't know. More like here? Yeah. Oh, Any other places? Any other places you can talk about? So yeah. Sorry. Any other places?
More outside of my body. I don't know. It's not like.
Oh, that's not good. That's not... No, I'm kidding. Okay. So we kind of got head and heart, and you know that's really kind of historically standard. The Greeks seem to have located themselves sort of in their heart, you know. And there's some theory that as people became more intellectualized, that feeling sort of went up to their head, and maybe before the heart there was the stomach, you know. And you know, you might think that you're your stomach if you were hungry all the time, right? I mean, you're just not ever hungry, so like why the hell would you think you were your stomach? But you know, that's another way that culture sort of keeps complexity at bay. You don't even, that's almost like a motivational state that modern people don't even have to contend with, because you're never really hungry. I mean, how many of you have gone without food for more than 24 hours? Oh, that's pretty good. How many of you involuntarily went without food for more than 24 hours? Oh yeah, well that's rough. Okay, how about a week? Nobody. How about 3 days? Okay, well, so, you know, there's a couple of people who've gone for reasonable periods of time without eating, but fundamentally you can tell we kind of got that problem under control. So you don't have to worry too much about you being your stomach, but I'll tell you, if you were starving at some point, that's probably where you'd locate yourself. Okay, so now you're inside the body, and so let's take a look at how the body works inside. So you kind of feel that you're in your brain, most of you anyways, and you know, you kind of think your brain is in your head, but really that's not right. I don't really understand ever why we kind of decided that our brains were in our head, because, well, look at it. There's the nervous system. It's like, it's not in your head. It's distributed through your whole body. There's a lot of it up in your head, but there's the whole spinal cord. That's an important thing. And then it has all these branching nerves that allow you to move your hands and to feel things. And it's like your nervous system is distributed all the way through your body. So it's not reasonable to think about the way that you operate as you see things with your brain and then you do things. Now, if that's sort of true, but there's important ways that it's not true at all, and it's important to know the ways that it's not true. It helps you understand phenomena that you couldn't otherwise understand. So I can give you an example. There are people who experience blindness, but it isn't because their eyes get damaged, it's because they have brain damage, and so it damages the visual cortex, and so that's the higher order part of the brain that's responsible for conscious vision. Okay, so maybe they get, I don't know, they get a tumor, or they get hit in the head, or they get shot or something, and then poof, they're blind. And so then they tell you they can't see anything, and then you say to them, okay, well, that's fine, you can't see anything, but let's play a game, okay? I'm going to hold up my left hand or my right hand, and you're going to guess about which I'm holding up. And so you do this, and they go right, and you do this, and they go left, 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 right, right. And they're right. And you tell them, you're right, and they say, well, I can't be, because I don't see anything. So that's blind sight. Okay, so here's another kind of blind sight. So you take the same person, and you set them in front of a screen, and you say, well, look at the screen, and they tell you, I told you already I can't see anything, and then you flash faces at them, and you check for changes in the conductivity of their skin, because when people react emotionally, they sweat a little more, a little less, and that changes how electricity passes through their skin. And so you show them a smiling face, and there's not much of a change, and you know, you show them a neutral face, and there's not much of a change, and then you show them like a really aggressive or really afraid face, and poof, it spikes. And you do that a number of times, and you show them, well, as soon as I show you a face of someone who's afraid or a face of someone who's angry, you react to it psychophysiologically. You think, well, how the hell can that happen if they can't see? And the answer to that is, you don't just see with your vision. You see with your body. And so one of the things that you'll find, for example, if you go through Swanson's paper, I'll read you a little bit about this later, is that most of your senses map onto multiple levels of your nervous system. So some of them map right onto your spine. And that's good, because now and then your eyes should tell your spine to do something before you think, because thinking's too slow. And so, you know, you got to understand, like, way back when we were frogs, roughly speaking, we had eyes. We didn't have much of a brain. So like, what the hell were the eyes doing? It's not like the frog exactly sees. And you might think, well, how could eyes inform you about the world if you don't exactly see? And then you've got to kind of think about it in a Piagetian sense. It's like, here's an example. You might take an animal like a sponge, pretty simple animal, and it can open and close pores on the outside of its surface according to different changes in the ocean that surrounds it. And so its perception is sort of like, the ocean has 3 states, whatever those might be, maybe it has 10, I don't know, but for the sake of simplicity we'll say 3. The ocean manifests itself in 3 pattern states. In pattern state 1, I do this. In pattern state 2, I do this. In pattern state 3, I do this. And so it's direct pattern onto action mapping. And so animals can use their eyes just to react with. They don't have to see the thing. You know, because you think you see and then you act, but why do that? You can just react. And you know this already because, in a simple way, if you put your hand on a hot stove, you'll go like this, and then you'll feel the pain. And what that means is that your body has conserved the relationship between your sensory neurons and your motor neurons at a spinal level, so that your perception of the heat is this. It's not of the heat. It's just mapping a bodily pattern onto a sensory pattern. And so a lot of really primitive sensory input is exactly that. It's just the sense detects a pattern, and with no intermediary of interpretation, that pattern is translated into a behavioral output. And so there's actually generally, the simplest cells are sensory motor cells, so they do both. They map the pattern and they react, and then the sensory and the motor cells differentiate. And then neural tissue grows inside them. And so then what happens is that instead of an outside pattern being mapped immediately onto a behavioral pattern, the neural intermediary says, okay, this pattern could mean any of these 3 things. And then that neural layer grows and grows and grows until, in creatures like us, it's like a whopping layer. And so we see a pattern and we go, that could be this, 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 this. And then all of those things could be mapped onto this or this or this or this or this. So, you know, it makes us slower, but more flexible. And slow can be a problem. So like when you're walking down a pathway and a snake appears, you don't want to be thinking, you know, snake, rubber hose, stick, whatever, you know, because then you're dead because the snake bites you. What you want to do is catch the snake out of the corner of your eye and jump up into the air before you even know that you saw a snake. And you can do that because your eyes can map right onto your spine. And they don't just map right onto your spine, they map onto your nervous system at all sorts of levels. So for example, with the blind sight person who's looking at the face, so it's an angry face, the eyes are still mapping information onto the amygdala. And so the amygdala changes the psychophysiology. You know, it says prepare for threat. And so the person might feel uneasy. But it's weird, but that's a form of sight. To feel uneasy can be a form of sight. So, and that's to say even more clearly that your brain just isn't in your head. It's like, it's all the way up. It's all the way from, and this is a nice Piagetian viewpoint because, you know, in some sense what Piaget says about children is they sort of organize themselves from the spinal level upwards. You know, they learn these little subroutines. First of all, they have a few subroutines. Those are like built right into the spine. And then they start playing with those and chaining them together in flexible ways, and they keep doing that, you know, in more and more complex ways until they're capable of the abstract representation of thought. And you can see how this will work as we go through the nervous system. So your brain's in your body. In fact, there's some evidence, and there's more than one kind of nervous system too, right? There's the central nervous system that allows you to move voluntarily and that, you know, provides you with sensory feedback, some of which you're conscious of. There's also the autonomic nervous system that runs all the complex machinery that you're too stupid to attend to, you know, because your consciousness gets little jobs. It doesn't get to run your liver, for example. You imagine what your life would be like if you were in charge of your liver? It's like you'd have been dead years ago, because what do you know about livers? So you have a whole system, like the autonomic nervous system, which has more neurons than the central nervous system, that just runs all that stuff for you, which is, you know, a good thing, you know, and then you don't have to pay attention to it. So anyways, there's a lot of distribution of neural tissue throughout your body. And there's even some evidence that you have like a second brain of sorts in your solar plexus, where, you know, that's perhaps part of the reason why you really don't like to get hit there. But there's a tremendous number of serotonergic neurons, for example, in your midsection, and there's increasing evidence that those are associated with things like emotion and mood. And so the idea that the brain is here, it's like, no, not really. It's a continuum. You know, your body is a psychophysiological entity, and to separate it into body and mind is like, it's not right. The other thing that seems to be increasingly clear among, say, the robotics guys is you can't even be smart unless you have a body. And so that's why the advanced intelligence guys are building robots from the bottom up. They're doing it just like Piaget would have suggested. It's like, well, build some things that can move, and then chain those things that can move together so that they can move in more complex ways, and then chain them together so they can work in more complex ways. And once you've got this thing that can do things, then stick a brain on it. And then it'll have things it can do with its brain. And if you don't do it that way, you get something that can't function intelligently. It's close to that. So there is the brain, and the major, one way of dividing it into its major subcomponents is represented. There's a variety of ways you can do this. You can divide it into hemispheres because it's sort of split down the middle. The right hemisphere seems to be kind of specialized for the processing of unknown information, and the left seems to be more comfortable working where you know what's going to happen. And that the left is most generally the linguistic part of the brain, although not always. It's a rough, you know, what would you call it? It's a rough truth. There's lots of exceptions. The linguistic system tends to specialize in the left. And the left sort of insists that it knows what's going on. And the right is always looking out for things that don't fit and sort of convincing the left slowly and sort of under the table to change its viewpoints. And a lot of that seems to happen when you're asleep and you're dreaming. So the right, maybe what's happening when you're dreaming is that during the day your cognitive processes are pretty tight and defined, and they better be, right? Because you don't want to be dreaming your schizophrenic dreams in the daytime. That's a bad idea. So you got to stay kind of focused and narrow in a way during the day. But the problem with that narrow focus is that you're not paying attention to a lot of things. And so it kind of looks like your right hemisphere keeps track of the potentially important things that you're not keeping track of, and then at night your category system sort of broadens and loosens. You can tell that in dreams because they're so weird, and that's maybe when the right hemisphere is sort of tapping some new information into the left and playing with how it might be recategorized without completely overwhelming the left, because you don't want to, just because you learn something new doesn't mean you want to upset yourself totally, right? So it's a real complex dynamic between stability and learning, and it's conceivable that's why you have two hemispheres. So who knows? It's a good theory though, and the guy who came up with it fundamentally, his name is Goldberg, Elkonen Goldberg. He was a student of Alexander Luria's, who was a great neuropsychologist. So, you know, it's a credible idea. So here's some rough divisions. You've got your cerebellum. That cerebellum, we don't know what the hell that thing does. If you don't have one, you get all wobbly. But there's more neurons in the cerebellum than there are in the rest of the brain. So, like, is it just making you not wobbly? It seems like a tremendous devotion of resources to something that's relatively simple. So, alcohol, when you're a new drinker, alcohol is really hard on the cerebellum, which is why you're, you know, totally useless in a motorway and you fall down and all those things happen. But so that's the cerebellum, and we don't know what it does, even though it's very complexly branched. It kind of looks like a cauliflower, and it's just packed full of neurons. And then there's the occipital lobe, and that you kind of use that to see with, more or less. And then the parietal lobe kind of helps you keep track of who you are from a bodily perspective, and sort of where your body's located in space, and sort of who you are as an embodied person. So, for example, if you lose the right parietal lobe because you have a stroke, then you lose the left side of your body, and even more weirdly, you lose the left side of everything. So all of a sudden you can't see the left side of anything. And no one can figure out what that's like, because say I'm looking at this room and I have this parietal damage. If I'm looking at the room, do I not see the left side of the room? And then if I look at you, all of a sudden I don't see your left side. Like, we can't figure that out. Like, the left is gone, but then the left is relative to where you happen to be looking. I think one of the ways of understanding it is sort of like, you know how you clearly can't see anything behind your head. And it's not black where you can't see, right? It's black if you close your eyes. But there's a difference between what you can't see behind your head and the black you see when you close your eyes, because the black sort of seems like nothing. But compared to what's behind your head, it's not nothing at all. So I think what happens with people who have neglect, parietal damage, is that like back part just goes like this. And so instead of, you know, you seeing this much of the world and this being just not there at all as far as vision is concerned, it goes like this. And so then you've only got like a quarter of the world that you're, and so people like that, sometimes they'll throw their own legs out of bed. So they wake up and they think, oh my God, because they can kind of detect the left, but not very well. And they're quite freaked out because, you know, like, do you really want to wake up with a leg in bed with you? No, so they grab it and throw it out, and that's not so good because they're attached to it. Or so they'll eat, and they only eat half the food on their plate. But if you turn the plate, then they'll eat half of the half that's left. So anyways, that's the parietal lobe. Temporal lobe. That enables you to hear, roughly speaking. There's a lot of memory there too. And the frontal lobe, well, first of all, the frontal lobe seems to allow you to make voluntary movements, sort of at the highest level of abstraction. And then the prefrontal cortex, which would be right at the front of the yellow there, it's sort of like the back part of the frontal lobe enables you to make voluntary movements. But the prefrontal cortex enables you to represent the potential motor movements that you might make before you implement them. And so it evolved out of the motor strip during the course of evolution. It's sort of like, well, first you learned how to act voluntarily, and then as that grew, and it's particularly big in human beings, that part was able to divorce actions from your body, represent them in an abstract space, run them as simulations, calculate the outcome, and then implement them or not. And you know, it's a hit and miss business because lots of you people undoubtedly simulate catastrophic outcomes and then go do whatever it is you were going to do anyways. Like, you know, that happens to people all the time, say when they're trying to stop drinking or to stop using cocaine or not to binge eat. Or so, you know, your prefrontal cortex can whip up these simulations, but other parts of your body can override them quite badly. So that's sort of roughly the brain, at least from, you know, looking at it from the side. And then this is it split down the middle. And you can see that it's not precisely two hemispheres all the way down. In the middle, it's one thing, and then it grows these two things like a little hat. And as far as I'm concerned, all the important parts of the brain are low down, central, old. You know, because people like to think that, well, if it evolved a long time ago, it's primitive. It's like, no. If it evolved a long time ago, it's been around a long time. It's really smart. That's why you don't run your liver. The autonomic nervous system runs it because it's been around for an awful long time and it knows exactly how to do it. And so it's really, in some sense, the new parts of the brain in many ways are the parts that are primitive. So and the old parts are extremely necessary and sophisticated. And so the areas we're going to concentrate on most particularly are, well, the cortex we've already talked about. The cortex is probably responsible. People like to think of it as responsible for consciousness, and there's something about that that's right, but it's quite clear that human beings can remain conscious even if they have a substantial amount of damage to the cerebral cortex. So consciousness is a really weird thing. We're not very good at figuring out where it's localized at all. Cerebral cortex, thalamus. The thalamus is the place where all your sensory information comes together. So, you know, when you look at the world, it's kind of like a continuum of experience despite the fact that you have these 5 different sensory inputs. And the thalamus seems to sort of unite all that, and then it sends the messages that it amalgamates up to the cortex, and the cortex sends them back, and the thalamus sends them back, and there's like this loop between the thalamus and the cortex. And maybe that's part of what consciousness is. You know, rather than being localized in an area, it could easily be a process. And you know, the fact that consciousness sort of turns on in the morning, which is a very weird thing, seems to indicate to me that it's probably something like that. It's a loop. It's the looping interaction between brain areas. And you know, if something's looping like that, it gets really weird properties. So that's a positive feedback system, you know. And I don't know if you've ever hooked a video camera to a TV and then turned the video camera on the TV. You know, it starts doing extremely weird things. You can get all sorts of unbelievably complex designs and weird phenomena because the TV is recycling its own signal, you know. So there's this circuit in there that's looping. And I suspect consciousness is something like that. The hippocampus is responsible for the movement of short-term information into long-term storage. It's a very important part of the brain. We'll talk about that more next time. The amygdala is responsible for a lot of emotional responses. And the hypothalamus is responsible for a lot of primordial motivational states.